Time to spark up an inferno and practice our flames. I've been painting this Pyre Troll for Hordes for a little while now casually, but it's time for the most important part, and that's the flaming fists. But I'll be honest, I'm not that confident about how I want to do it. So I want to practice a few ways of doing fire on some spell effects models first, and a couple of ways just to find out which will be the best for this burning boy. The first way I want to attempt the fire is by going from a dark red all the way up through an orange and then a yellow to a white, so that the brightest points are at the tips of the flames. Setting up my palette, I'll add black, red, magenta, yellow oxide, azo yellow, and white. I'm going to see if I can mix out all my colors first, starting with some black into the red along with a tiny bit of magenta. Then using a brush full of that mix, add some of the yellow oxide. This should get me a dark reddish orange at first, then by gradually adding a little bit more, take it a few steps up. Then when it looks like a nice light orange, that's when I start to add some of the more intense yellow. With those mixes, I want to jump up a little and start a large batch of the light yellow and just use a tiny bit of the orange from the last mix to offset it slightly. Then start adding some white to get me my highlight yellows. So the thing about heavy body acrylics, especially these ones which are quite thick, is that they can be a little hard to make blends on a wet palette with. But in a very simple way, I can actually make that wet palette do the work for me when it comes to thinning it out, by just closing the lid and walking away. In that little hothouse I've created, the paint will start to pull some of the moisture from the sponge and into the paint, so that when I come back to it in a short 15 to 30 minutes later, it'll open up into a more hydrated state. Getting back to it, I'm going to start with a base coat of the dark red, made with the red, magenta, and black. But I'm going to be lazy about it for just this first part and get it done with my hairbrush, over a base coat of a neutral gray. Like a base coat with a brush, I do it in a few passes, making sure it's nice and even so that I'm starting from a nice dark starting point. Breaking out the brush again, I'm going to start layering these mixes up, taking paint into my brush, then wicking some out onto a paper towel. With this first one, it's just the red and magenta mixed, and I'm going to be picking out the branches of the fire, leaving any of the more concave areas alone for now. When I start to get into the more orange territory, the layering method stays the same, but now I'm going to focus on higher branches of the fire plumes. Unless it's really rounded, then focus some of this color towards the middle of that rounded part, since light I think would be coming out bright from it. Time for a little break. Not one in which I stop painting, but a blending break. Using the last mix I just layered and adding it to my airbrush in a thinned out way, I'm going to use it to help blend these layers together a bit better. Slowly building up some color around where I've painted the last layer so that it feathers off a bit, except at the top of the flames where I go a bit more all out so that I have somewhere to go even lighter. Getting into the more yellow side of orange now, I start to pick out ridges and edges instead of full gouts of flame, aiming my brush towards anything that points outwards. Near the tips though, I'm a bit more generous with the thickness of the layer, since I've essentially re-base coated it in the last step. So I'm starting a bit more from scratch where these light parts are. Getting into yellow oxide proper now, because this is quite an opaque color, it will be a good base for a transition into the bright yellow. But that means two things. First, that I have to layer it like I did the last one, just a bit more narrow, and two, that I need to take another airbrush break, making sure that this yellow is nice and opaque where I layered it and feathered otherwise. Still with the airbrush now, I'm going to skip a yellow and go right to some white. I want the final layer of the yellow to be quite vibrant, but in order to facilitate that, I want to create some hot spots with my airbrush first, finding points around the flames that punctuate outwards and giving them a quick circle of light, giving each one about 2 spritzes, letting it dry between each. Last thing I want to do now is get that yellow to glow. Sticking with the airbrush, I can be a little less precise with it and just put a nice thin layer of the pure yellow evenly over the white dots I had made in the previous step. Not only blending the white into the surrounding colors, but also using the white to make it nice and vibrant for a final layer. So here we go, a fire done in the traditional dark to light layering and blending techniques. It's classic and familiar, and follows the same kind of steps as most all other layering. I did struggle a bit with the white, it was clogging up my airbrush. So in retrospect, I feel like I do both brush and airbrush for the white instead of relying on just the airbrush. But now it's time to flip the script, or in this case colors, as instead of starting dark and going light, I'm going to reverse the order and start light and go dark. For this one, I'm pretty sure I'll rely on the brush more, except here at the start, because I want a nice even layer of the bright yellow. I'm going to start this one where I left off the last one, with a base of white, then a very even coating of the pure azo or vibrant yellow. And I want to make sure I get inside of every valley and nook, since it's technically going to be my brightest color, and once it's down, I should never be touching it again. I say technically because when looking at pictures of fire, the lower part of the fire is the brightest, so I want to get that effect before moving up along the fire with the darker colors. So mix a bit of white into the azo yellow and start highlighting layers, but only on the rounded curves of the base where the fire should technically be the hottest. Since the base is already a nice bright yellow, there's no real need for a raw yellow oxide layer. So the first layer is actually going to be a bright orange, though it is made with a bit of yellow oxide, as well as a red and magenta. Like I did for the dark to light fire, I'm going to layer up using my large brush, which was wicked on a paper towel. I make sure to leave plenty of yellow in the crevices, and if I get close to the white layer, thin the paint on my brush to glaze it down instead. That color then gets followed up with something with a bit more red and magenta in it. Like the previous fire, I want to start layering towards the rounded edges of the flames, but a bit thicker in the upper part. Because I don't want to break out the airbrush for this one, I'm going to do a brush glaze at the tips of the flames as well, because I feel this is where the intensity of the flames would start to die out overall, so it doesn't need as much yellow poking through. I'm going to jump right up to the pure magenta and red now, because they're going over lighter colors, they'll stay quite a bit more vibrant, so there's no reason to be gradual about it. Keeping it thin though, and making sure it's even in my brush. With every single one of these color layers, I try and apply them twice, which is actually really easy on a fire like this, because I just keep spinning and painting until I'm happy with it. Also being quite generous again, towards the tips of the flames. For the final red, magenta, and black, I'm going to go a little off script like I did with the white, and instead of painting this on the highest points, I'm going to paint it inside the valleys near the tips of the flames. Because I think in a fire, the brightest point would still be where the flames are thickest, and they're pretty thin in the crevices. So it would make sense to darken those versus the thicker parts in these flame tips. So while it wasn't exactly backwards, since there was still some highlighting and shading, starting light and going to the dark colors did have a really neat effect, even though it's a bit more difficult to do. So I think this is going to be the method I use to do the troll's fists, but with some amendments after lessons learned. So I think I know what went wrong with the last fire, but before I can attempt to change my method for the troll, I have to prepare the fists first and make them lighter again. So using my airbrush and white paint, I'm going to slowly respray the fire, but also a tiny bit of the surrounding area so that the blending into the fists can start a bit brighter too. I need to touch up the white a little bit with a brush, extending some of the edge highlights down the spines of the flames so that they have a more natural cutoff point. So I think my mistake was that I didn't account for variance among the length of the fire. There should have been more orange near the base and less yellow peeking through at the tips. So to fix that, I'm going to create a blend on the fire fist, from yellow to the red, but mixing orange in between. And I'll split it up for each fist, using the airbrush on one, but also showing how I do it with a brush for the other. For the airbrush fist, because I'm going dark over light, it should just be a simple case of using each color over top the other, just reducing my focus each time towards the tip. So I'll start with an overall yellow like I did for the previous fire model, nothing's changing there. But when I get to the orange, I reduce my spray to just halfway up the fire, again getting an even coverage. But before moving on to the next color, I'm also going to take some of the same color onto a brush and use it to extend some of the orange down into the valleys around the yellow. This way, the yellow is never just on its own. Then I'll do the same thing for the red, which is red and magenta, with a tiny bit of yellow oxide, only spraying at the top third of the flame. Then, like the light orange, I'll use a brush to have that extend down through the valleys surrounding it. Not too far though, just enough to have them end in a point. To do the same thing, but with a brush, I'm going to be doing some wet blending. So first thing I'll do is make some base layers and areas for each of the colors. I'll start with the yellow at the base of the flames, then skip the orange for now and go to the red-orange at the top. Now we have two solid colors for our in-between. That in-between then gets a layer of the orange overlapping as needed. So far, we haven't done the wet blending, but what I'm doing here is actually making a base coat for the wet blending to go over. You know how 2 thin coats is kind of the standard for base coats? Well, this is thin coat 1, even though there is 2 coats of each color. For thin coat 2, that's where we get into the wet blending, getting all the colors ready on the palette first and thinning them with some slow dry thinner. I'll use a large brush to add a heavy amount of the yellow to the yellow area, not worrying about the bottom edges since we can go over that later. Then the same for the orange-red at the top. While they're wet, I'll load my brush with the orange and paint a stripe through the center between the other 2 colors. Now the magic. I'll start to move my brush down towards the yellow first as it's the lighter of the 2 colors, and start mixing those paints right on the model. Then I'll draw that paint through the center again before reaching the red, just blending a little bit into that color. Now this will take a little while to dry, and once it does, I want to grab the yellow again and make sure the very base where the flames meet the fists is nice and even as well. So from here the process on both of them is going to be the same. I'm going to add a pure red and magenta mix layer like I did in the practice towards the tips of the most outward flames, and the lighter yellow towards the base of the flames where the hot spots would be, highlighting the edges down there like I would any other edge. The last thing is to add a bit of darkness, adding a bit of black into the red magenta mix. I wash it into the deepest parts of the flames around the tips of the plumes, a couple times just to make sure it's dark enough. A few small details later, and my jowly boy is burning bright. Having had the practice now, I think I get a better sense of how flames on miniatures work, a bit better while going from dark to light or light to dark. And the main takeaway for me is that the brightest color should always be closer to the source of the flame than further away. So even if I were to redo the first method, I'd know now to put those highlights near the plumes at the base of the fire and not the tips of it like I did. But that's why we journey, to learn these lessons. Please subscribe if you'd like to see more videos like this one, or just other fun things to do with painting miniatures. And until next time, enjoy your own painting journey.